one of the problems and challenges of this field is that there's no agreed upon terminology or conceptions. There's many different terms to describe many different aspects of this program, this type of activity, and they have important and distinguishing nuances, and some, frankly, are just academic vanity, nuances of academic vanity. But we were talking for the purposes of what we're discussing today is a similar basket of capabilities. The term that I will use is a term most commonly used in the international community of security sector reform, or SSR. It is not a perfect term. It means different things to different people, but this is not an academic conference today. We will talk more also that SSR is more than training and equipping soldiers. Training and equipping gives you better dressed soldiers who shoot straighter. SSR is actually far more complicated than training and equipping, which is the mantra we hear coming out of the Pentagon and others consistently. It is the complex task of transforming a security sector into a apolitical, legitimate, professional security force that upholds the rule of law. That is more than training and equipping. Training and equipping is necessary but insufficient to achieve this. We're talking about creating institutions, professional ethos, etc. The purpose of SSR is quite simply to help a state consolidate its monopoly of force to uphold its rule of law. There are many different definitions of SSR. This is one that I think for a policymaker is perhaps the most universal. So when I talk about the security sector, what am I talking about? And colleagues may disagree with you, I am not talking about safety. This is not OSHA standards. This is security, defending a population and a state from threats domestic and external. It is also those institutions which are directly responsible for the security of a state. I have a taxonomy I use to describe the security sector. It's like a pyramid. On the bottom are operational actors. These are the actors, the police, the military, prisons, border control, that interface directly with people and populations. Managing them are institutions, ministries of defense, ministries of interior, et cetera. It changes based on the state. And above this is our oversight bodies, the executive, legislative branch. You could include civil society, NGOs, media, et cetera. Not included in this are non-statutory forces like militia. By definition, a state cannot have a monopoly of force if it has unauthorized actors out there contesting its monopoly of force. Unfortunately, this has been a trend in recent UN missions, for example, South Sudan, where they take a military and its enemies and put them all into one big military and call that peace. That is not peace. It's a recipe for disaster, as we've seen in South Sudan, which has recently, in the last year or two, blown up. But this is a difficult task. So how do you transform a security sector that may be an instrument of terror into one of justice and democracy? Or put another way, and I think this is the ultimate metric for success, is how do you create a soldier or policeman that a child would run towards for protection than away from in fear? Again, if a failure to do this, as we've seen in Iraq, will lead to strategic failure. And we've seen this quite a bit. So currently, US programs in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in 2012, more coalition soldiers were killed at the hands of the Afghan recruits than they were by actual Taliban. In Mali, the coup in Mali that basically set the Sahel on fire, requiring the French to intervene, was staged by US-trained Mali soldiers. But the US is not alone in this challenge. The UN has also has had bleak record in SSR, Congo, Haiti, East Timor, Timor-Leste, 2004 coup d'etat was led by police that were trained by the UN. And people tend to look out and say, well, give me an example of success. One example I would submit, although Truth in Advertising, I was involved in this, is Liberia. The Liberian military went through a 14-year civil war that was even venal by African standards and committed great human rights atrocities. Today, the Liberian military is a stronger institution and even sent a peacekeeping contingent to Mali. So why is SSR so difficult? So briefly, and I come to this as a practitioner as well, having done this in Africa for several years. First, as we've seen in Iraq, is that the risk of the security sector being co-opted by ambitious generals or politicians is great and can do much more harm than good. Second is this train and equip mentality presents a cognitive barrier for what is possible in SSR or FID. Third, it takes a long time, 10 years or more. Are we talking South Korea? This is what's required. Four, these are deeply political programs. They're not like food programs. We're talking conflict-affected states. You're talking about rewiring who has the monopoly of force. That becomes deeply political very quickly, and technical approaches will fail. Next is that this is an inherently interagency. USAID, DoD have a hard time sometimes getting along or agreeing on what security even means. It's the same for the United Nations, UNDP versus UNDPKO. Creating a new security sector may threaten the local population and regional neighbors, which will reject it. And there's a lack of know-how, which is hard to believe that after 15 years of this or more that there is this, but there is no comprehensive practitioner guides. You can't give somebody a manual and say, okay, help stand up an SSR program in Mali. Doesn't really exist, I would argue. Talking about Liberia quickly, for some lessons learned quickly, Liberia, again, suffered a 14-year civil war. It's a small, where we had child soldiers, blood diamonds. Militia would capture people and ask them if you want long sleeve or short sleeve. If you said long sleeve, they'd chop off your wrist right here, short sleeve up here. Rape was both a tactic and a strategy of war. It was a severe human rights catastrophe. When we got there, the military itself was responsible for a good deal of these human rights abuses. So my role there with my partners there was to figure out how to create SSR and successfully so. So here are some prerequisites I would suggest before you consider as a policymaker, can we do SSR? First of all, cessation of fighting. I don't believe SSR can work if there's low intensity conflict or greater going on in the region. Second, who's going to be providing security during SSR? Someone needs to be doing it. In Liberia, we had the UN, which was useful. Third, a peace agreement between all warring parties that lays out as much as possible what the program will be. Who's in the 5 Ws, and who's eligible, timelines, goals, and so forth. Four, for the host state, for the state undergoing the reform, is there a political will of the regime, or will they find this threatening? How about the people? The people of Liberia were very wary about a new military being created there, since the old military was a perpetuator of human rights abuse. For donors, do we have the resources, time, and domestic political support for a long-term program? 6 is understanding what the causes of the conflict were to begin with. It's very tempting to cut and paste Department of Defense templates for doctrine onto places like Afghanistan, where they may not be suited. And 7, do we have a workable plan and a competent program to create this program? So quickly, here are 10 tips for those who wish to raise armies in the future, or police forces. I will not go over the entire list due to time constraints, but I will say this, is that we must do a better job at human rights vetting of candidates. We'd never dream of putting a cop on the DC streets or enlist somebody in the Marine Corps without doing a thorough background check, yet that happens every day in the Congo and Iraq. And there are inherent dilemmas. For example, security versus justice. We like to think that security and justice buttress one another, but they don't always do so. Do you have to grant amnesty to combatants to get them to lay down their weapons, for example? Or do you hand over your records of who's in your army to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, et cetera? There are a lot of finer points that brief well in theory or in Washington, but are hard to operationalize on the ground. So in conclusion, I would just advocate being humble about what we can do. Perhaps the US can't do something, or others, the UN cannot do something, and non-action might be better in some cases than some action. For example, do we want a half-made security sector than no-made security sector, to be kind of crass about it? You can argue both sides for that.